Thank you, Doug. What a generous and undeserved introduction. Let me knock some of the spirit out of that by talking about my pants. When I was getting coffee this morning, one of you said to me, "I hope one day I have the courage to wear pants that color." And I said, well, I got these in Vienna, and now I've realized I really am going native. I've been in Europe 4 years now, and I'm wearing German pants. So anyway, I'm going to talk about Europe today and what it has to do with us. In the early summer of 2025, 20,000 young Catholics gathered in Paris for a 3-day, 60-mile pilgrimage to Chartres, a cathedral town on the ancient pilgrim trail to Santiago de Compostela. Mostly French, with groups from Europe, North America, and even South America, these pilgrims, average age 19 years old, were devotees of the traditional Latin Mass. Their vibrant faith defies a post-Christian culture that should have erased such devotion. Yet they walked joyfully, tracing the steps of countless pilgrims before them. These young people grew up in what the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman calls liquid modernity. Hans Boersma talked about this the other night. It's a phrase you often hear among our community, liquid modernity. And this is a world where constant change submerges markers of meaning and direction. Freed from ties to God, tradition, or society, they are, as the French novelist Michel Houellebecq writes, elemental particles, drifting in radical individualism, chasing fleeting desires. Bauman contrasts this with people of the past when they lived as pilgrims on a shared, meaningful journey to a common destination. Today, he says, most of us live as tourists, flitting from experience to experience, seeking escape from boredom. The Chartres pilgrims sought to shed their tourist identities and reclaim the pilgrim's quest, reconnecting with God and Europe's Christian past. Matthew Whitzan, a 25-year-old Canadian who was on the pilgrimage, explained to me, a tourist sees beautiful things but doesn't see them pointing to God. A pilgrim recognizes them as signs of the divine. He told me that he was in Europe to learn how to see the cathedrals and everything else with the eyes of a pilgrim. Well, there are pilgrimage sites all over Europe, but there's something special about the Chartres Cathedral itself. In Universe of Stone, his biography of the cathedral, the science journalist Philip Ball writes of the spell the Gothic masterpiece cast. He writes, there are few buildings in the world that exude such a sense of meaning, intention, signification, that tell you so clearly and so forcefully that these stones were put in place according to a philosophy of awesome proportions, appropriate to the lithic immensity of the church itself. Now, these pilgrims I met sought re-enchantment beneath the soaring vaults of this cathedral. William Cash, a Catholic journalist from England who joined them, told me, quote, this is not a retreat. This is about embracing tradition and making it live today. Amid Latin chants broadcast from the cathedral, pilgrims carried banners honoring saints, claiming the sanctified past and the memory of Christendom. While not a full Christian revival in a largely secular Europe, these young people could spark renewed evangelization and a recovery of the West's ancestral faith. I remember standing there looking out at the crowd and thinking, if we're going to be saved from the civilizational calamity, it's this generation that's going to do it. The Chartres Cathedral stands as a monument to what Christendom once was, and it also stands to these kids as a beacon of what it might be again, at least in their lives. It is a prophetic manifestation of light and beauty amid the darkness of an ugly world that does not comprehend the message engraved in its stones and proclaimed in the glow of its ruby, emerald, and azure glass. It's a reminder from eternity that it is always possible to turn back to what is true, good, beautiful, and eternal, and which had once given delight dignity, and hope to poor men and women whose names have been lost to history. Now, this 2025 pilgrimage was the 43rd since its revival, and it's dedicated to honor Our Lady of Christendom. It looks back to a pre-modern Europe united by faith against rival civilizations, particularly Islam. This spirit was evident among the pilgrims, some of them carrying Jerusalem crosses, symbols of the medieval crusaders. Now, this resonates especially in a Europe grappling with tensions from Islamic mass migration. Indeed, David Betts, a war studies professor at King's College London, has been warning that conditions are ripe for civil war in Europe, especially in France and Britain. Some believe that the French are returning to their ancestral faith to face these challenges. And as an aside here, if you don't know the name David Betts, go to YouTube. It's B-E-T-Z. He's given some interviews this year talking about why civil war is likely to come to Europe. And it's chilling stuff. You do not see this in the American media anywhere, but I particularly recommend a podcast interview he did with the European Conservative. He's a very sober-minded man, and these are just things we need to be conscious of. But Western civilization, born in Europe, faces a profound crisis. Having lived in Europe for the last 4 years, I can see the laments that Europe has become nothing more than a museum for tourists. But we Americans cannot afford to be indifferent to what happens to Europe. We are of the West too, and that means that we are all sons and daughters of European Christendom. The historian Tom Holland, in his great book Dominion, notes that many values secular liberals like him cherish owe their existence to Christianity. Europe's attempt to build a secular, materialist civilization is badly faltering, with whole regions either Islamizing or repaganizing. Modernist Christianity, embarrassed by the traditionalist among them, lacks the strength to resist. In fact, in Europe, you have both Catholic and Protestant bishops, including the Pope, who say, bring more migrants in, bring more in, even as they are burning churches down in France. We will not save Europe or Western civilization without learning to love these places and their histories passionately again. Here's the thing. It's not simply about rediscovering devotion to the political, religious, and moral principles of Europe and the West. That's too abstract. We need more than that. In a number of interviews with those young Catholic pilgrims at the start of their journey, I asked them what they were searching for. In various ways, they all said, God, roots, and community. Can we have and hold on to God without roots and community? What are roots, and what is community? Those questions weighed heavily on my mind when a few days after the pilgrimage, I traveled to rural southwest France to visit Renaud Camus, a dark prophet dwelling in a small medieval stronghold, sitting atop a hill in a lonely village. Unjustly labeled a far-right radical for his great replacement theory, Camus argues that Europe's cultural erosion, driven by globalism and elite disdain for tradition, enables mass migration to threaten Europe's identity. The great replacement of the French people with foreigners began with what he calls the great deculturation, that is, the systematic demonization, rejection, and imposed forgetting of national traditions. Over tea, I brought up the well-known first line from Charles de Gaulle's autobiography, in which the great World War II general and savior of his country said, quote, "I have always had a certain idea of France." What, I put to Camus, is your idea of France? The old man bristled slightly behind his cottony white beard and said, "For me, France is not at all an idea. No nation is an idea. There are very important ideas in French culture, but France is not an idea. It is centuries of time. It is landscapes. It is castles. It is paintings, Poussin, Cézanne, Matisse. It's hundreds of things." He went on, People in power now have this absurd notion that France is what they call pompously Republican values. If you want to be French, you can simply affirm Republican values. That is monstrous. It's as if France began in 1789, the year of the revolution that swept away the Ancien Regime. Renaud Camus' point is that a nation's culture, its identity, indeed its soul, are not found merely in intellectual abstractions. Rather, they are embodied in the collection of traditions, art, literature, and artifacts of material culture, expressing the experience over centuries of a particular people living in a particular place. The old Frenchman, agnostic though he is about religion, is talking about sacramentality. That is, he's saying that the transcendent spirit of a people becomes accessible to us through material things, in a process one might call enchantment. I think we should all see the world this way, and especially in what, in my bleaker moments, feels like the passing of the West out of history. I think we should all learn to see and experience Europe like this, as pilgrims searching for our souls in its stones, its stained glass, and in the bones of its saints. The Chartres cathedral, like innumerable other manifestations of the European Christian spirit, can teach us hope. The question here is, does the resilience of Christianity, a universal religion, paradoxically require the resilience of nations? I think it does. Christianity is not simply a systematic compendium of theological and philosophical ideals, nor is it merely a moral stance towards the world, though it is both of those things. Still less is it only about the individual's personal relationship with God. The contemporary church historian Robert Louis Wilken has written that, quote, Christianity is a culture-forming religion, by which he means that it did not come into the world fully formed. Rather, what we call Christianity developed over time through the experience of many peoples and the cultures they developed out of their wrestling with those ideals and wrestling with God and what he meant to them. Wilken writes that, quote, culture has to do with the pattern of inherited meanings and sensibilities embedded in rituals, institutions, laws, practices, images, and stories of a people. But it also includes tangible products of human activity that can be seen and touched. Well, these are things like cathedrals, icons, music, liturgies, rituals, stories, and all of the material manifestations of faith in Jesus Christ. The Word became flesh and dwelled among us, says the Gospel of John. The eternal, infinite, transcendent God entered into time as a Jew, not just anybody, but as a Jew, and not just of anywhere at random, but of Roman Palestine, and not just any time, but under the reign of Caesar Augustus. For Christians, God did not appear as laws or propositions, but as a Hebrew God-man who embodied and fulfilled the law. I think in an analogous way, the same God reveals himself to us in history through matter, through nations and their cultures. Churches, monasteries, pilgrimages, symphonies, songs, poems, all of these are part of the grand story through which God speaks to us. Of course, none of these things have the same authority of the written word of God given to us in the Bible, but I don't think we're wrong to look at the Cathedral of Chartres as a kind of scripture written in stone. And it is a particularly French version of the gospel. Chartres is perhaps the queen of the 80 Gothic cathedrals that arose in northern France in the Middle Ages. But in northern France, and only in northern France, they arose. Earlier in its Christian history, France was the center of continental monasticism and institutions whose contributions to the building of Western civilization cannot be overstated. France was also central to the development of scholasticism and a mode of rational thinking that eventually developed into modern science. In fact, this thing we call Western civilization, though it has its roots in Greek philosophy, Roman law, and Hebrew religion, can be understood as the cumulative effects of the gospel as it was received and developed by particular peoples on the European continent. In Italy, long before the glories of the Italian Renaissance, the Roman Pope and the church he governed were more or less the only authorities in post-imperial Western Europe. The Roman Church Christianized barbarian peoples. In fact, the Harvard anthropologist Joe Henrich credits the Latin Church's changes to barbarian marriage customs with the emergence of individualism in the West. Henrich also credits the printing press, a German invention, and the rise of literacy with making the West distinctive. It is to German Christianity that we owe the Reformation. Though Catholics today understandably think of that event as a calamity, it nevertheless gave us the Bible in the vernacular, and German Christianity also gave us Bach. English Christianity influenced the development of common law, which laid the foundation for modern constitutional law and individual rights. English evangelicals led the successful fight for the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade. And though Spanish Christians participated in that evil business, we cannot overlook the fact that whatever their mixed motives, the Spanish brought Christianity to what is now called Latin America. The conquistadors were not saints, but they managed to destroy the satanic Aztec Empire, which sacrificed countless human beings on altars to demons. I could go on. All over Western Europe, the reception and the absorption of the Christian faith by distinct peoples created a civilization that was both diverse and harmonious. The more time I spend in Europe, the more aware I become as an American how difficult it is to separate love of the faith from the love of one's own nation, that is to say, one's own people. Well, let me emphasize here, I don't want any confusion, that to divinize one's tribe, its history, and its cultural artifacts can be idol worship. But to see them, to order your loves rightly, and to see them as signs pointing to God is to place them properly within the hierarchy of meaning, and to give our faith form, substance, and weight. It is to make concrete the memory of the Lord who once walked among us, and who, as Christians, we believe dwells eternally with us. To cease to see these things as signs, and to love them in all their imperfection as a precious inheritance of embodied wisdom, is to begin to lose God. And that spiritual crisis is at the root of our civilizational crisis today. Again, could it be paradoxically true that the survival of Christianity, the universal religion, depends on the resilience of nations and the consciousness of ourselves as distinct peoples with distinct stories and distinct traditions? Renaud Camus has said, quote, "A people that knows its classics will not allow itself to be led into the dustbin of history without a fight. In the same way, a people that knows its religion and all that came from that religious history will not surrender, will not submit." We should not only know these things, but we should also love them and cherish them, not in a triumphalist way. It's not necessary to sneer at the gifts and talents of other nations in order to appreciate one's own, but we should love them in the same way that one loves one's family. No man who loves his own wife will be threatened by the man who insists that, no, his wife is the most beautiful woman in the world. Christianity, once again, is a universal religion, no argument there. But it did not drop from the sky fully formed. It developed by being received by particular peoples, first in the Mediterranean and Near East, and then into Western Europe, the Slavic lands, and Scandinavia. These peoples formed nations from their shared memories, shared sacrifices, and shared faith. It is not a coincidence that the abandonment of Christianity by those same peoples coincide with their loss of confidence in their civilization, and what the cognitive scientist John Vervaeke calls domicide, the murder of one's own home. John Vervaeke is not a Christian, but he's not an atheist either. He lectures extensively on what he calls the meaning crisis. If you watch Jonathan Pajot's videos, you will have seen and heard John Vervaeke. Vervaeke argues that this widespread loss of belief in meaning and the nihilism that replaces it emerges in large part from modernity's metaphysical error. Now, this requires a little unpacking. When we talk about meaning, we inevitably presuppose connection, patterns, and networks of patterns. These patterns allow us to relate to each other and to the world outside our heads. Says Vervaeke, quote, it may sound high-minded and mystical, but self-transcendence is an essential need for human beings. It performs core functions of our cognition, unquote. This is because cognition is participatory. We form social networks that allow us to solve problems and to exist in the world not as disconnected objects, but as subjects capable of knowing and being known. Early in humankind's development, people created rituals that imparted a sense of meaning to their experience. In the distant past, people felt at one with the natural world. Again, this is Vervaeke's teaching. Yet with the coming of what is called the axial age, that extraordinary historical period of around 800 BC to 200 AD, to 200 BC, in which similar tectonic religious and cultural changes happened across various parts of the globe, we saw in axial age Greece philosophers like Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle emerge. At the same time, Confucius and Lao Tzu appeared in China, as did the Buddha in India. And this was also the era of the Hebrew prophets. The axial age laid the foundations for several subsequent civilizations. Consciousness changed in the axial age, says Vervaeke. Quote, we came into a new way of seeing, of knowing, and being. The world changed because we changed, because the meaning of things changed. People began to believe that the world of matter was in some sense an illusion, that the real world was that which lay beyond the appearance of matter. The point of life in the axial age was not to conform to the world as it is, but rather as a responsible individual to rise above it and to harmonize oneself with higher values and transcendent realities. And Christianity, of course, emerged out of Jewish religion of the axial age. Vervaeke calls the myths and practices of the axial age psychotechnologies that allow humans to thrive within a world of myth, meaning, and ritual. For Christians, the grand story of the Bible and of the church, with its complex liturgies and practices and traditions, tell us who we are and what we are supposed to do. So modernity, though, has shattered this metaphysical order. In the High Middle Ages, the triumph within Western theology of nominalism, which held there is no intrinsic meaning, no logos in the material world, but that things only mean something because God wills it, that began the long process of disembedding Christianity from the material world. The book to read about this is Heavenly Participation by our own Hans Boersma. Now, this did not mean, of course, that everybody ceased to be Christian all at once. But it did mean that Christianity got on the path gradually to becoming more a matter of abstract cognition, of doctrines and arguments and syllogisms, systematic theology, rather than something felt and participated in. It became more a matter of the transfer of information than enmeshment with the divine through participation. You know, the great Canadian Catholic media theorist Marshall McLuhan said that we have two modes of cognition: concept, that's the abstract one, and percept, the perceiving, participatory one. He said we need both to have a healthy mind. This is something Ian McGilchrist has taught. He said, McLuhan said, though, that people have to realize that religion is primarily percept, and the main mode of percept for the Christian is prayer. McLuhan, who is a daily Mass-going Catholic, said, everybody I know who lost their faith began with ceasing to pray. When religion becomes nothing but concept, but abstraction, it begins to die. For pre-modern people, back to John Vervaeke, for pre-modern people, knowing is not the apprehension of facts seen dispassionately from the outside. It's nothing you can acquire from a distance. You know something by assuming its identity, by becoming it. Becoming it somehow changes it, reveals it, and makes it real. The book to read about this is Matt Crawford's The World Beyond Your Head. Throughout the Middle Ages, Christians in the West believed that they lived embedded in a cosmos, a universal, divinely given structure, both seen and unseen, that told them who they were and how existence was to be ordered. This made the world feel like home and served to secure our relationship to God, to found the social order in God, the source of our being, the giver of law, and the savior of our souls. The Christian cosmos revealed itself in rituals, in holy places like Chartres, in art, in music, and culture. If Jesus of Nazareth was, as St. John tells us, the Word, logos, the Greek word for underlying rational order, the Word made flesh, then the expressions of culture that emerged out of humankind's encounter with Jesus in the gospel was a second-order version of the same incarnational principle. So when we moderns turned our religion into something that is primarily a matter of affirming abstract theological propositions as distinct from participatory forms of knowing, we fell into what Vervaeke calls domicide, again defined as the murder of our sense of being at home in the world. In a domicidal culture, we cease to be pilgrims and instead can't help but turn into tourists. Our homes are no longer our homes. We're just visiting. The goal of those 20,000 young Catholics on the road to Chartres was to rediscover their spiritual and cultural domus, their home. They were on what the ancient Greeks called a nostos journey, a pilgrimage toward both God and a sense of being at home in the world, a return to home. Those pilgrims seek to be universally Christian and locally French, and they see no contradiction in it because there isn't one. It's a paradox, but it's not a contradiction. It is undeniably the case that the Chartres pilgrimage mixed religious feeling with some nationalist fervor, though to my eyes of a healthy, not a chauvinistic sort. These young people see clearly that the ongoing dissolution of their ancestral religion is part and parcel of the ongoing dissolution of themselves as a distinct people. Now, this is a process deliberately designed and executed by European elites in Brussels and in government buildings in Western Europe's national capitals, as well as in universities and in newsrooms. Earlier this week in our country, we all saw a startling manifestation of what you might call Christian nationalism in the Charlie Kirk Memorial Service. I know that Christian nationalism is a controversial concept. In some forms, like conflating the kingdom of God with earthly kingdoms, it is a dangerous heresy. But if it's simply a matter of recognizing without apology that our own nation and other nations were founded on a confession of faith in the God of the Bible, then such a realization is vital to our own national survival. Liberalism, secular liberalism, cannot hold us together. We see this now. Europe is more advanced in this than we are, but we're all on the same road. Now, we should be clear about the risk of Christian nationalism, but we cannot allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good. Writing as Nazi bombs fell on London, T.S. Eliot said, quote, "Our choice now is not between one abstract form and another, but between a pagan and necessarily stunted culture and a religious and necessarily imperfect culture." I think that's our choice today, too. Eliot warned that it is not enough to be simply democratic. Democracy must have a positive, vigorous vision at its core, or it will be transformed by other forces within democratic society. Eliot famously said, "If you will not have God, and he is a jealous God, you should pay your respects to Hitler or Stalin." This is the crisis Europe faces today, and so do we. Through its abandonment of Christianity and replacement by sentimental humanitarianism and a shallow faith in multiculturalism, Europe has imported millions of Muslims who do have a clear vision for society, but it's not our vision. They believe in something, whereas our people in Europe don't believe in anything. If Europe will not have the God of the Bible, it will sooner or later have the God of the Quran, or some other deity. There is another threat far more powerful, I think, and far more relevant to American domicide than Islamic migration, what Paul Kingsnorth calls the machine. That is to say, the technology, especially artificial intelligence, that is engulfing us all at great speed. The philosopher Anton Barbecue says that digital technology is a spiritual technology because it controls our attention. What we pay attention to is what becomes our reality. The more time we spend online in a virtual world, the more we lose touch with our bodies and with the material world around us, the world beyond our head. Soon, there's no meaningful difference in terms of our psychology between virtual reality and reality itself. I suspect that fact has a lot to do with what turned that young man raised in a conservative Christian home into an assassin who killed Charlie Kirk. Once I argued with a Christian who carried in his backpack a virtual reality headset. He told me that this is how he attended church. He explained that he met in virtual space, in the metaverse, with other Christians from around the world for a worship service. This, he believed, was the future of Christian worship. Well, we talked about whether it mattered that Christians gathered in their bodies in a particular place, a real place, to praise God. Well, as you know, I'm an Orthodox Christian from a sacramental and liturgical tradition, so it's impossible for us to worship virtually. But this man came from a low-church Protestant tradition for whom worship consisted only of shared reading of the Bible, receiving information from a sermon and reacting to it, and singing hymns together. For him, you could do all of this in the metaverse, so what's the problem? Well, our argument soon moved toward metaphysics. Finally, I put the question to him. I was so frustrated. Are you saying there is no difference between the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which was built over the sites where Jesus was crucified and resurrected, and a Walmart parking lot? Yeah, that's right, he affirmed. There is no difference. God is equally accessible everywhere. Well, he was right in a very shallow sense, but wrong in a far deeper way. God is everywhere present and fills all things, but there is a such thing as sacred places, sacred relics, and holy objects and holy locations. Humans are embodied creatures. We need rituals, sacred places, sacred time, holy people, and communal gatherings to make our abstract ideas about the divine tangible. They provide a framework for expressing beliefs and making them communicable to others and across time so we can hand them on to our children and our grandchildren. Again, it's true that the God of the Bible is in all places, but the existence of sacred places allows us to encounter him and to focus our attention on him in a particular way. These material expressions of religious ideas are a bridge between the mind and the world. They anchor us to reality. True, they are not sufficient to guarantee the continuity of faith. If they were, then the faith would still be strong in Europe. But they are necessary, because if we lose them, then our abstract beliefs will not be enough to withstand the passage of time and the vicissitudes of human attention. This is not a theological truth, but an anthropological one and a psychological one. I met recently at the Midwestuary here in Chicago a young woman, Courtney Chartres, who was telling me and others at the conference about being present with a group of Baptist pastors she was among, who were being pitched on how they could employ artificial intelligence to improve their ministry. And she said it just shocked her, the things that she was hearing about the disembodiment of Christian worship. She said every one of those pastors thought this was awesome, anything to get the message out better. But she said that they were endorsing what would amount to their own spiritual domicile. Anyway, making sacred times, sacred places, and sacred rituals, that's just what humans do and always have done until the advent of modern Western man, who convinced himself that matter really doesn't matter. The great 20th century religious thinker Mircea Eliade said that for pre-modern man, to encounter the living God was, quote, not an idea, an abstract notion, or a mere moral allegory. To be in contact with the sacred, he went on, is to be in contact with power, the power that created the cosmos. Holy places, holy rituals, holy people, and such like give gravity to our abstract beliefs. Said Eliade, quote, if the world is to be lived in, it must be founded, and no world can come to birth in the chaos and homogeneity and relativity of profane space. It's worth quoting Eliade at length on this point. By manifesting the sacred, he said, any object becomes something else, yet it continues to remain itself. for it continues to participate in its surrounding cosmic milieu. A sacred stone remains a stone, apparently, or more precisely from the profane point of view. Nothing distinguishes it from all other stones. But for those to whom a stone reveals itself as sacred, its immediate reality is transmuted into a supernatural reality. In other words, for those who have a religious experience, all of nature is capable of revealing itself as a cosmic sacrality. The cosmos in its entirety can become a hierophany. That's the word he used to mean a manifestation of the divine. In other words, our religious ancestors were aware of something profoundly true about human nature, but that we have abandoned. They knew better than we do. They knew that sacred places like the Chartres cathedral, artifacts and the like were points of physical contact with ultimate reality, and that without them to orient ourselves, we would be lost. Few of us can articulate it, but most of us share what Richard Weaver called, quote, an intuitive feeling about the immanent nature of reality. And this is the sanction to which other ideas and beliefs are ultimately referred for verification. Without the metaphysical dream, I love that phrase of Weaver's, without the metaphysical dream, it is impossible to think of men living together harmoniously over an extent of time. The dream carries with it an evaluation, which is the bond of spiritual community. It's like this. A people capable upon looking at Gothic cathedrals as a place where God is especially present, and also in some sense as an expression of themselves as a particular people. These are people who share the same understanding of how the cosmos is ordered. This is a people that is capable of surviving over time, of being resilient against every challenge thrown at the nation and its faith. This, I think, is what the atheist René Camus was getting at when he said that France is not an idea, but a collection of concrete manifestations of the imagination and spirit of a distinct people that live together in a particular place over great stretches of time. Without it, our cultures, our nations, our societies, our families, and even our own personalities fragment and disintegrate. This is what's happening today to the people of Europe, of America, and of all the Western world. We all know this. Moreover, as I mentioned earlier, the long process of disembodiment as man merges with the machine is accelerating at terrifying speed with the coming of AI. We are already seeing people preferring the pleasant, frictionless artificial reality given to them by AI to the messiness of physical reality. You all may have heard, if you read my Substack, you certainly will have seen this, the story in the New York Times about the 28-year-old woman who's married, but she spends 60 hours a week on ChatGPT with her AI lover, Leo, who gives her things that her husband can't. And her husband doesn't care because he's busy with his porn. This is what we're dealing with. The fight to reclaim our roots in the stones and stories and songs of Christian Europe, it is part of our fight against Islam. This is a fight you won't hear about in the media, but if you live in Europe, you know that it is very real. But it's also part of the fight against the machine. Those 20,000 young French Catholic pilgrims formed a battle column in the culture war. Their joyful trek brings to mind these lines of the 19th century French writer Ernest Renan. He said, "These are the essential conditions of being a people, having common glories in the past and a will to continue them in the present, having made great things together and wishing to make them again. One loves in proportion to the sacrifices that one has committed and the troubles that one has suffered. One loves the house that one has built and the house that one passes on." Those pilgrims were walking to the house of the Lord. They were going back to the future. Now, there's a fictional Frenchman who tried a similar journey but failed for his lack of courage and an unwillingness to sacrifice. The protagonist of Michel Houellebecq's novel Submission is Francois, a dissolute professor at the Sorbonne. A spiritually exhausted, de-Christianized France is on the verge of electing an Islamist government. Now, Francois is an atheist, but if he joins the herd and converts to Islam, he can be guaranteed a safe job and multiple submissive wives in the new order. They don't care if he really believes. They just want him to formally convert. Well, on a holiday in southwest France, while he's thinking about this, somebody suggests to Francois that he visit a remote town that was once a major pilgrimage destination of the Middle Ages. The tourist tells him, at Rocamadour, the town Rocamadour, you'll see what a great civilization medieval Christendom really was. So Francois makes the journey. He spends days there, repeatedly visiting the cave-like chapel where a blackened wooden statue of the Virgin and her Son rests high above the altar. He observes, it bore witness to a vanished universe. Focusing on the Christ child, Francois says, quote, this was not the baby Jesus. This was already the King of the world. His serenity and the impression he gave of spiritual power, of intangible energy, were almost terrifying. Now, I too visited Rocamadour this year, and what the fictional Francois saw is very real. So back to the book. One day, sitting in the back of the darkened chapel, listening to young Catholic pilgrims sing the poetry of Charles Péguy, the Catholic poet of the early 20th century who revived the Chartres pilgrimage, Francois has a mystical experience. He says, I felt ready to give up everything, not really for my country, but in general. I was in a strange state. It seemed that the Virgin was rising from her pedestal and growing in the air. The baby Jesus seemed ready to detach himself from her, and it seemed to me that all he had to do was raise his right hand, and the pagans and the idolaters would be destroyed, and the keys of the world restored to him as its Lord, as its possessor, and as its master. Then he hears a chanted verse of Péguy, a hymn to the Virgin, calling the prodigal son home. You think, here it is. He's going to submit to Christ. But no. At the pivotal moment, the writer refuses the call. Francois convinces himself that the mystical moment was caused by something he ate. He leaves Rocamadour, he returns to Paris, and cynically converts to Islam because it was easy, and he was going along with the crowd. Well, we are in some ways, all of us, like Francois standing before the Virgin of Rocamadour. If we listen, we can hear the call to return from our prodigal lives in modernity. We must know that the power of God in the Christian faith is real and can be especially felt in these sacred places in the midst of communities like the young Catholic chanters in the novel. Pope Benedict said, quote, only through men who have been touched by God can God come near to men. Even we who have not been prodigals of the Lord should interrogate our own hearts and ask, have we been prodigals to our earthly fathers and mothers and the houses they built and defended with their own prayers and sacrifices? Have we lacked piety in the Roman sense towards what we were handed down by our ancestors? If so, why don't we do it? What holds us back? Is it fear? Is it lack of faith? Is it apathy? Now, we will not recover medieval Christendom, and we shouldn't even try. But the faith of our fathers, the faith of our mothers, the way remains there, waiting to be taken up again. It's still there in all the old churches and cathedrals of Europe, in the monasteries, the castles, the medieval streets, squares, and canals. It's in the liturgies, the painting, the music, the literature. It's in the poetry, the drama, the philosophy, and the theology. It's in the tombs of saints and warriors. It's on pilgrim trails, many of them long overgrown, but calling on us to tread them again with searching hearts and eyes open to wonder. They took this from us, the moderns, and now in the hour of the West's peril, approaching what some say is its death rattle, it's time to take it back. We stand there, we prodigals, in the mysterious darkness of the cliff church at Rocamadour. If we listen with pilgrims' ears, we can hear the call, come home. After all that they, our fathers and mothers, suffered and died to build and preserve, are we going to be the generation that lets it die forever? We're not called to make paradise on earth. We're just called to build a home. We're not summoned to love our home because it is perfect. We are summoned to love it because it is ours. We are fighting for the recovery of a culture and a civilization that can give birth to men and women like those saints and sinners who built our home here in the lands of the West. We are fighting to recover a Christian culture capable of producing men with chests. We're fighting to recover a culture that can give birth to women like Joan of Arc and men like Francis of Assisi. And dare I say it, we're fighting to recover a culture that can form men like Charlie Kirk. In Europe, we are fighting against the rise in our homelands of a rival religion that has been Christianity's ancient enemy, and under whose reign elsewhere in the world, Christians today are horribly persecuted. And perhaps most of all, we're fighting against a machine that would efface the image of God in ourselves and in all the world, rendering the portals of holiness and icons of the divine presence into mere material for museums and objects for consumption. Now, we're in this fight whether we want to be or not. The Lord God has died in the hearts and minds of many in the West, but all of us in this room we all know that our Redeemer liveth. Those young men and women on the wall to Chartres have been told by their atheist society in France that God is dead, but they don't believe that news, fake news. Alistair McIntyre famously said that we cannot know what to do until we first know the story of which we are a part. Those young pilgrims want the old story for themselves, the story of how to be a Christian, and how to be a Christian as a dweller in the lands of Europe. Their every step on the road to the cathedral were like strokes of 40,000 pens, writing a new chapter in the narrative of our peoples. The sermons in stone and in stained glass and paint and music of all the Christian nations of the West, these make our invisible God visible. And they are words in our own story, the story of which we are all a part. Though we Americans live on the other side of the ocean in a country that is yet young, Europe is not an island to us. It's our home too. The final chapter has not yet been written, at least not here in the West. It is beginning to dawn on the younger generations that secular liberalism, godless liberalism, is not adequate to deal with the problems of a godless culture or a formerly Christian nation into which Islamic immigrants are pouring day by day. They will have to build some restored version of Christendom, or their nations will not survive this meaning crisis. Neither will our own. So we must take up our own pens, so to speak, and we must put on our rucksacks and walk to Chartres. We have to become pilgrims, not tourists. What the generations of the last century sought to tear down, let us rebuild our home. Just as St. Francis in the Middle Ages rebuilt the church. The hour is late, my friends. The journey is long, and the stakes could not be higher. Thank you.